Welcome to another episode of the Carry Trainer Higher Line podcast. Hey guys, welcome to yet another episode of the Carry Trainer Higher Line podcast. We've got a special friend today, new friend coming from the other side of the planet, like top, bottom side. So we've got Dr. Tim Crowe, a specialist in all things nutrition. You're a doctor and a researcher. What else would you describe yourself as, Dr. Crowe?
The sort of hats I wear are a nutritionist, nutrition scientist, media communicator, scientist, educator, whatever fits the role that I'm working at the moment. So my whole career has been as what I call a scientific nerd. I've been in research, but now increasingly I just work in the area of nutrition science communication. And if there's one area that is replete with lots of information and lots of different information, it's going to be the field of nutrition. We all have our own particular views on that. So I try and give a bit of clarity to that space.
I bet. And so you guys are going to hear what attracted me to Dr. Crowe's work is he takes a lot of the, I would say, myths or commonly held beliefs that people talk about. Like in my lifetime, we had the four food groups, and then the pyramid, and I don't even know what it is now. But we've got these concepts like that are near and dear to people. Like when I was a kid, fat was terrible. Now people put freaking butter in their coffee and smear it, on everything because now it's the best thing for you. So you take things like that and you break it down using science, which I'm a big fan of facts and real research, and help people understand it, right? That's kind of what you do.
That's sort of where I come from. And I actually acknowledge the science is not perfect, particularly in nutrition. I don't have all the answers. Science doesn't have all the answers. And if you've got a particular agenda, you can find a bit of research to support any particular viewpoint you've got, be it a food or a nutrient, either increasing or decreasing the risk of disease. So I try and take a step back and going, what does the bulk of the research say? But also acknowledge everybody is different in how food affects us. And that's a different thing to research. So I try and meld all of that together to come up with something that isn't too crazy. And spoiler alert, most of my message come back to, hey, eat less processed crap and eat more fruits, vegetables, and foods high in fiber. That's pretty much it. That's a nutrition degree.
Good old-fashioned common sense. I like it.
Pretty much, yeah.
One of the things, so you've got a podcast. What is the title of it?
It's called Thinking Nutrition. You'll get it on all the platforms.
It's a great podcast. The audio's well produced. So for you audiophile nerds that appreciate that, you'll dig it. It's good audio. But what I like, as you go through your explanation of whatever the topic is, you will say throughout the discussion, and I'll leave you a link to that study in the notes. And here is the doctor or the organization or the college that did the study. And you talk about that. It's not just Dr. Tim's opinion. You cite where you got your data from.
Yeah, and that's the approach. That's my bias. We all have biases. My bias is 30 years in scientific research. But even the research I cite is never just one study. It's typically what's called systematic reviews, where people get all of the research in a field and they combine it together. So most of what I cite is those types of papers, rather than just one interesting study, which on its own could be fairly meaningless. I try and actually add a bit more depth to it without turning it into a full-on science nerd podcast. I try and avoid all the complex terminology. I just give you the summary of what you need to know. Here's the information, but the key thing is this is for you to do what you want with. I'm not telling you have to eat paleo or vegan or low carb. Do what works for you, but here's some evidence you might want to take into account in making those decisions about what you choose to eat.
I like it. Real quick, what is your background? Where'd you go to school? You're in Melbourne, Australia now. What's your background?
Yeah, so as you listeners can tell, I'm Australian born. I went to school here in Melbourne. I trained as a scientist at university. I did a PhD in science, in particular molecular biology, so a lot of the gene interaction effects. And then I had a little bit of a career change where I actually went and retrained as a dietitian. So I actually did more study in the area of nutrition and dietetics. And then for something different, I actually went back to the university sector for 16 years, and I was a professor in nutrition at Deakin University here in Melbourne. So I love the research, I love the teaching, but increasingly it was the communication side of nutrition. So I do a lot of media work, I do a lot of stuff through my blogs, through my podcast. I do a lot of education work for health professionals. I talk about the science of nutrition and how to make sense of that. So that's where I've ended up in my career now as a freelance health and medical writer, or whatever hat I'm wearing on a particular day.
Okay, so you're not employed by a university or a hospital system or something like that at the moment?
No, I left it all behind a couple of years ago. I work as a freelancer. So most of what I do is under my own banner of Thinking
Perfect.
Nutrition. I do teaching into universities. I do lots of consulting work, but really it's just my own business now, which I love to do because I get to choose what work I do and what I communicate, and not be tied up with a particular, job where you have to adhere to those sorts of requirements all the time.
I like that. I've been self-employed most all my adult life, so I can concur with that being a good lifestyle.
It's great. After 5 years, I could never see myself going back to having one job and one boss. I mean, every job I do, I have a boss. That's your client you work for. But, being your own boss is actually fantastic. You're choosing the work you choose to do, which is great. And I get to talk about nutrition all the time.
You are a geek, as you called yourself, a nerd.
Totally. Card-carrying geek. So that's the bias that I have in everything I do. You can count on science, you can count on research, but also knowing that after being in the business for many years, a lot of what I held as solid research and evidence has changed over time, and the quality of the evidence is not always the best. So I'm not too dogmatic in what I hold on to. Here is what the current research says, but that will change in the future. And that is no different from any other field of science. Research changes. To say that nutritionists got it wrong because they told us to eat low fat some decades ago means we should not listen to anything they say. Advice changes and research changes. And that's just one good example. The low fat message. Thank God we've left that behind us. But the message was never eat low fat and eat really low fat, highly processed foods. It was still eating healthy foods. But food industry responds to those sorts of recommendations with a whole raft of products to meet those needs and demands.
Then you get all the marketing, and then people become brainwashed by all of the stuff that they see constantly and hear.
Exactly. And so food trends change based upon what the nutrition science is saying. So at the moment, low carb's been coming out of fashion for 30 or 40 years under different names and brandings, but low carb is a popular dietary trend. It will decline, and then something else will replace it, and then it will come back again. So I just roll with these trends and fads rather than try and fight them, because they work for some people, and all power to you. If a low carb or a vegan diet or whatever works for you, that's great. Here are some things to keep in mind to actually make sure that you've got the best health possible if you're eating like that way.
Mm-hmm. I think a great way to kind of dig into some of your work is, like in our training, we always talk about what's the goal. Like before we begin anything, any training, any communication, I always start with what's the goal. And like when we talk nutrition, I would think, of course, if we take away, I want it to taste good, like we want to eat because we need good fuel and all of that. So you did the Blue Zone discussion, and why don't you tell the listener viewers what that's all about?
So the Blue Zone is one of the most fascinating areas in nutrition to me, because rather than take the view of, let's try and evaluate all these different types of diets and foods to see what's the healthiest, let's look at people that have already nailed it. Let's look at people that are living very long, very healthy lives, pretty much free of disease until their last couple of years. And what regions of the world do we see these people? And these were areas called blue zones, which was identified as small parts on a map, where they drew blue circles around villages in Sardinia, where they saw that people had very long, healthy lives. And this grew to identifying 5 different regions in the world where people live like this. It's Sardinia, it's Icaria, which is a Greek island, it's Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, it's Okinawa in Japan, which I think most people would be aware of the Okinawans and their long lives. And the 5th one is totally random. It's actually in the United States. It's in Loma Linda. Now, what's special about Loma Linda, Mickey? Do you know anything about Loma Linda in California?
That is where the Church of Latter-day Saints, right?
Correct. That's right. Yeah. So it's really an epicenter for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So because so many people there follow the teachings of that church, it affects the whole community. So people in Loma Linda have
no coffee.
That's it. Yep.
No
vegetarian diet, all of that. But from a research perspective, you can see people in this area live 10 years longer than the average American, which is pretty phenomenal. And all the blue zones, you see high longevity, less rates of colorectal and breast cancer, less rates of dementia, and long lives and healthy lives. So the blue zones are a really nice little microcosm of clues we can take for our own lifestyle.
And why I thought that was a good way to dig in. Everybody, well, I don't like the word everybody. It's very common to talk about Mediterranean style diets nowadays. But in that research, you point out that folks in Costa Rica are not eating the same things the people in Okinawa are eating, are not eating the same things as the people in Greece or Italy are eating. So talk about that.
Yeah, so we hear a lot about the Mediterranean diet, and it's a great diet, but also it's not the best diet, it's the best research diet. And when you do lots of research in a field, that really biases the work. The dietary patterns eaten in Costa Rica and
say
Okinawa,
that again, Doc, about the biased research. Say that again, please.
Oh, sorry, biased not in terms of the research is fraudulent. We just see that one particular area gets more research than others. So if most of the research is in the Mediterranean diet, that creates some level of bias that other areas don't get as much focus. So I would say a Japanese style diet, other types of dietary patterns can be just as healthy as a Mediterranean style diet. If you want to follow a Mediterranean style diet, good luck to you. It's a good diet. But there's other dietary patterns that can be just as good. We just don't have as much research in it. So Mediterranean diet is the pin-up boy. It's the poster boy, gets all of the attention. But from the blue zones, we know other dietary patterns can be just as healthy for you. And that's important. If you're from a Vietnamese background, it'd be crazy to follow a Mediterranean style diet. You want to eat something that's more culturally,
there's no olives here,
culturally appropriate to you. So that's why I say Mediterranean diet is great, but it's not the be all and end all. And so the blue zones, what are the dietary themes in the blue zones? And it's mostly plants, but they're not all vegetarians. It's only in Loma Linda that you see the vegetarian diet. So I always say if you want to be a vegetarian, great, but you can be just as healthy being an omnivore. One of the key, when I use the word superfood, the key food that is common across all of these blue zones is one of the most unloved, unsexy foods anyone would hear about.
Legumes, right?
Legumes, yeah, they are so boring. They are so cheap and they are so nutritious. And yet we always go for the quinoa and all of the superfoods that come into and out of fashion, whereas it's legumes are actually one of the best foods. They are great for the environment. They are cheap, great source of protein, and it's one of the common foods eaten across blue zones. So I would say I'm not going to be dogmatic about advice, but if there's one thing you're not eating much of in your diet, and let's face it, most people don't eat a lot of legumes, it's just one dietary change you could make, and baked beans count as legumes. Just quietly, if you want to ease yourself into it.
Does it ruin them when you buy the commercial baked beans that are full of like corn syrup and that kind of stuff?
It makes them not as good because of the things that are added to it. But if it's a way to get you to start eating a few more, that's a good place to start. Okay. Then you can probably branch out a little bit more.
Now, a lot of times people hear about like Okinawa and they assume that they're consuming tons of fish. That's not exactly correct, is it?
Yeah, that's really interesting because you would think the reason why Okinawans live so long is because they eat all this fish. They actually don't eat a lot of fish. What they do eat lots of is they're the highest consumers of tofu in the world, which is from soybeans, which again is a legume. And they eat lots of sweet potatoes. They don't eat a lot of fish. So it's more so the types of other foods they include in their diet. But the thing about Okinawa is the blue zones applies to people that were there some time ago, because there's been a big shift in the Okinawan diet since the end of World War II. And what happened then? The influx of the American bases and obviously the more culturalization to an American lifestyle and diet for the Okinawans rather than their traditional diet. So you actually see a change in their diet and disease risk over time because they shift their diet to more of a Western style diet.
More of the processed foods and...
Yeah, just typical. And that's one thing we eat too much of. I mean, in Australia, a third of our food calories at least comes from highly processed foods. So we're seeing a lot of research into this that is probably not surprising. The more highly processed foods, and they're called ultra processed foods that are in your diet, the worse your health is going to be. But you don't need a nutrition scientist to tell you that.
Did you say ultra processed?
Yeah. So rather than talking about processed is bad, all food is processed to an extent. unless you're eating just fresh fruit and vegetables. Even cooking is a form of processing. So we have this new terminology that's being adopted, or at least being increasingly researched, called ultra-processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
So we have processed foods and then ultra-processed. And typically ultra-processed foods have a long list of ingredients. They undergo a lot of industrial formulations, to change the structure of the food. And, a diet high in these is going to be linked with, obesity, heart disease, cancer, and depression, and so on. But generally, an ultra-processed food diet is what we would probably call more of a junk food diet. But it just gives a better terminology, because the word processed, don't eat processed foods, is ridiculous. Most foods are processed to some extent. But if you compare, whole grain foods is more minimally processed, whereas white flour and white bread is more ultra processed because of the degree of industrial processes that food has gone through.
Can we talk a little bit about that? There's an interesting kind of undertone when people that research these things, from my intelligent standpoint, just the average person that's not a scientist or a doctor, and you almost develop an adversarial viewpoint, kind of like when people talk about government, they, them, like there's some guy in a white coat at Acme Flour Company going, I'm going to kill all these sons of bitches and I'm going to ultra process the shit out of this flour. I did some research a few years ago on canning, because we throw so much stuff in the garbage with expiration dates. And I'm not a miser where I want to eat spoiled food, but I know that when the date on the can goes off, the contents don't just explode. And it was crazy to find that some of this stuff lasts decades longer than what you think, which isn't what I'm asking about. I know a lot of that processing has to do with longevity, storage, et cetera. But just comment on that a little bit.
So here is a concept. In the end, food companies don't want to kill their customers, but in the end, also they want to make a lot of money. And we are humans, and we enjoy the taste of salt and fat and sugar. And if you get the right mix of those together, you make a food what's called hyper palatable. Really yummy, basically.
Delicious.
And if something's hyper palatable, you'll eat more of them. And we've all been there. You open the packet of chips on the couch and you just keep eating and eating and eating. You can't stop at one. Is that the Pringles marketing spin?
Sure.
So a lot of food is designed to make us overconsume. And now if we overconsume it, that's great for the company because they make more profits, but it's not so good for us. Yes. And that's where it comes from. It's this hyperpalatability. It's almost called a sweet spot, but it's not the sugar. If we were truly addicted to sugar, we just would eat raw sugar and would be happy. Typically, it's a mix of sugar and fat together that increases the hyperpalatability, not so much one of those on their own. So if you play with a mix of flavors and different nutrients in them, you can make a food more desirable. And most of the foods that are very desirable and hyperpalatable definitely fall in the ultra-processed food category.
Interesting.
So food industry does have a role to play in this, but also we have some level of choice in this, but it's very hard to fight against it when everything around us is designed to make us consume these foods, from advertising to point of sale promotions and so on. So it's what we call more of an obesogenic environment. It's the food environment we're around. Whereas if you go to Costa Rica, you probably don't have as much of those influences. You're more informed by the local diet that people eat.
At which, I think that's the thing a lot of folks in industrialized countries have no concept of, what people are eating elsewhere. There's this notion that all the food is nutritionless these days. The ground is depleted and all the food is nutritionless. So now we need to fortify and do all these processing things. So talk about that a little bit. Is the tomato that I grow in my garden nutritionless because of acid rain and the depleted soils and all that business?
So I'm calling on science here, and there's been quite a bit of research done in comparing foods today to decades and 100 years ago, and there has not been a big shift in the nutrition of them overall. What does change, though, is if you improve crop yields in a fixed area, that means there's only so much nutrients that can actually go into the plants. If you have more plants, you just dilute out the nutrients. So any decline in nutrients that we see in food has been because of increased crop yields from a given hectare. Overall, food that we grow and produce ourselves is incredibly nutritious for us. It's only when we start ultra processing them and stripping out nutrients and changing into a form that's very different to what originally was that we lose a lot of the beneficial nutrients. But overall, that our food supply is pretty good. It's just the food choices that we have, that we make, change the quality of our diet.
I see. I think I heard you say something to the effect in one of your recordings that we have like the best food source now as a species ever in humanity.
This is it. We have the most nutritious, healthy, available food supply in the history of humankind. And that's a big statement, but it is true. Any time of the day or night, if you're living in a Western country, you can walk into a convenience store or a supermarket, and if you choose, you can buy a whole range of fruit and vegetables available year-round. You can buy pretty much any food that you like. So it's our choices that decide if it's going to be fairly healthy or not so healthy. But the availability of food has never been better, and the safety of food has never been better in the history of mankind. It's more so the quality of foods available that are pushing out a lot of the more healthier foods in our food supply.
That brings up another question. So I've got all these questions I wanted to ask you. So I walk in the grocery store. I like bell peppers. My wife likes bell peppers. I walk up to the produce pile and I see a bell pepper that's beautiful, and I see one that's less beautiful, and the less beautiful one's the organic one, and it's twice as much money. Yeah. Do I buy the organic one or the commercially produced ones with pesticides and herbicides and all that stuff? And costs notwithstanding, is one better for me?
Excellent question. I'm going to start by telling something about me. I very rarely inject myself in the story, but with all of my nutrition science background, I don't buy organic food. So, but if you want to buy it, that's fantastic for you. The reason why is when I look at all the research, any different in nutrients is minor at best. And yes, you mentioned the pesticides things. Organic produce can be produced with pesticides. They are naturally more natural pesticides, but they can be still just as harmful and toxic for the environment if you use lots of them. So the idea that organic is pesticide free is not true. Okay. The levels of pesticides in these foods are incredibly low, and they're monitored. So when I look at the research, I look at the nutrient composition. If I look at the pesticides research, if I look at even the environmental impacts, because you get lower crop yields with organic versus conventional, it actually has a higher environmental footprint. I look at it all and going, it's not worth the extra money to pay for the organic compared to conventional when they could be double the price. So if you want to buy organic, or anyone wants to buy organic, fantastic, do it. Because our biggest issue is we don't eat enough of these foods in the first place, that's being fruits and vegetables. But I make the choice that I just don't see much of a role for organic produce in our diet.
So you're not concerned? There's people that I've met, folks that are on a lifelong quest to eradicate the world of the likes of Monsanto and their ilk, like the Roundup. I mean, people write their studies, or rather, studies is a bad word. There are reports and documentaries and things of that nature that basically would make us think that like the world is just full of Roundup and we're all going to die of brain cancer from it, and we need to buy some organic grapes and we'll solve all the problems.
So I'm not a shill for anyone. If you have too much Roundup, that's going to be very harmful for you. If you have too much copper sulfate, which is a pesticide that can be used in organic food production, that will be just as harmful for you. So it's the dose of these that you actually get from the foods that matters. But also realistically, if you don't use any pesticides at all, it really would not be viable to at a global level to feed the population on organic produce, because the yields would be much, much lower. So my view is I look at the science, and when I look at what it says about pesticides, it's really not a concern for me, because 99% of the pesticides you consume each day willingly are naturally present in food in the first place. Because a lot of these things that are healthy for us in foods, they're called polyphenols, actually work as natural pesticides for the plant to protect itself from insects and other plants. So we consume loads of pesticides already, just the dose is very low.
Interesting.
That's the perspective I have. So I'd say to anyone, if they're concerned about pesticides and that's enough to drive you to organic, wonderful. I'm not going to tell you not to do it. I just say that when I look at the research as a nutrition scientist, it does not concern me one bit.
Interesting. I like that. It is an interesting topic. There are folks that think we should all have our own little farm with a couple of goats and some chickens, and that's a fun concept.
Oh, that'd be wonderful, Mickey. Let's all live in Nevada and grow our own produce. Is that going to happen anytime soon? No.
Right, and I think it's impossible. But the explosion of humans, I think, if somebody just takes a cursory look at how we're able to have so many billions of people now, it's because we have so much food, and we're able to produce, and we've got John Deere and Case and these companies that make amazing farm equipment that can till up millions of acres of ground and harvest, and the machinery that we've created is mind-blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest impact on the environment is being a human being. There's no such thing as having a zero impact. We all have an impact on the environment. Even whatever food choices we have an impact, be it organic or junk food, it has an impact. So it comes down to how can you minimize your own particular impact and what works for you with your own particular ethics and morals. And I'm not here to lecture anyone on what the ethics or morals should be. That's your own personal decision.
I do like how you always predicate your conversations on that, where I, on the other hand, put my morals and ethics on everybody. They can kiss my ass.
And that's why we get on so well on this topics.
Hey, I put a post up and asked people to put some questions out. So I've got a few. Here's one. My buddy Steve says, is all our food, flour, milk, eggs, etc., just garbage? Are people really all gluten intolerant, lactose intolerant, or is this just trendy? And I know there's a lot there.
There's a bit there. I'll start with the last bit for easy one. Yeah, well, loads of people are lactose intolerant. It's something that naturally, if you're from a non-Caucasian background, you see a high prevalence of lactose intolerance. So that's going to be Asian, African-American background. But if you're Caucasian, many people can tolerate lactose because we maintain this enzyme throughout life. So it's a true thing. It's not a fad. Loads of people are lactose intolerant. Gluten's a different one. Now, if you've got celiac disease, absolutely, you can't touch gluten. But there's this sort of hazy area called non-celiac gluten sensitivity that it might be that a small percentage of people are what we call intolerant to gluten. And they may do better by cutting it out in the diet. But there's actually no diagnostic way to determine if you've got gluten intolerance. Hence, let's just go on a gluten-free diet as a bit of a cure-all for your bloated belly from your IBS and your weight gain and all of these other problems, which may have nothing to do with gluten at all.
It seems like in the last, 5 years or so, every restaurant has a gluten-free menu. We've got a very lovely local restaurant that we frequent, a nice steakhouse, and her complete establishment is gluten-free. I think they beat you if you bring anything in there with gluten on it. But she's legitimately, the owner's got some issues where if she touches gluten, she gets super sick. But what is the percentage of people, do we know, that are actually having real issues?
Look, the figures I've seen, maybe 2 to 3%, maybe slightly a bit higher, as potentially having non-celiac gluten intolerance. But it's a bit of a hazy area. And in fact, it may not even be gluten. It may be even this bigger category of natural food chemicals called FODMAPs. I don't know if that's ever been on your radar.
I've never heard the word. What is the word again?
So FODMAPs are just a whole bunch of natural plant chemicals that includes gluten, but a whole bunch of others that can cause...
How do I spell that word?
It's an acronym. It's FODMAPS. And I won't go into what each of them stand for. It's a really popular diet for people to follow to treat IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. That's obviously a big thing. So it might be all of these FODMAPs that you find in grains and cereals, but also onions, celery, artichoke. So a low FODMAP diet might be better rather than just cutting out gluten. But gluten falls under the umbrella of potentially in this FODMAP family. So that may be what's actually happening when people make a dietary change to a gluten-free diet. But what I find is that when all of these trends come and go, and it's gluten-free diets popular, if you start focusing on removing a particular dietary culprit, be it real or not, what generally happens is you are more conscious of the food that goes in your mouth. Now, when you're more conscious of the food that goes in your mouth, you're probably less likely to eat burgers and fries and more likely to eat healthier food. And guess what happens? You suddenly start feeling better, and you attribute that to the food that you've cut out, where it might just be you've changed the whole diet. And that's probably where gluten-free comes from. The one positive of this interest in gluten-free diets is it's great for people with celiac disease. They've got so much more choice available to them.
Do we know what the percentage of the population is that has celiac?
It's depends on what ethnic background you are, but I know for Australian context, which won't be too much different to America, perhaps it's about 1 in 70, 1 in 100. So it's pretty common.
Oh, okay. So significantly more than I
huge.
thought.
Absolutely. In Ireland, it's much, much higher than that. But I think for Australia, it's about 1 in 70. So it's common. Yeah, very.
Is it a
common.
genetic disease, or is it something that comes on later in life?
Oh, that's an excellent question. There certainly is a genetic component to it, but there may be an environmental trigger for it as well. So it starts to fall under this umbrella of more autoimmune conditions as well, because the body recognizes gluten as a harmful substance, and that just causes your small intestine, which is normally, has this huge surface area because of all these little things called villi. If you think back to your high school biology, it goes flat, dead flat. In which case, you've got a flat small intestine, you can't absorb hardly anything. So you get some serious side effects from that.
Wow. Okay. All right. Very interesting. How about the lactose, like the intolerance you talked about, but I keep hearing people talk about cheese, milk, yogurt, and I'm not talking about purple yogurt that's made with a bunch of sugar and shit that kids drink out of a tube, but like real yogurt or kefir or something like that crap causes inflammation. It's all whole body inflammation. It's garbage. We should totally get rid of all the mammals that are making this shit and round them up, toss them in the ocean.
So you've just summarized what the internet tells you. What does science say? It says the complete and utter opposite. If you look at dairy foods in general, they're actually anti-inflammatory. They contain a whole range of bioactive compounds that actually reduce inflammation. Particularly when you're talking about dairy, if you're talking about things like yogurt, that's actually a probiotic. That's beneficial. If you've actually got lactose intolerance, some of the harder cheeses in yogurt, again, have less lactose because it's fermented. So they're generally less of a problem. And even when it comes down to this trope you read that, humans are the only species that drink the milk of other species as a reason not to consume dairy foods. Well, humans are the only species that, build rockets and fly to the moon. So that's a bit of a stupid argument. It's just ridiculous.
Or build contraptions like this to talk over the oceans. Yeah.
We could go all day. But the thing is, in the wild, I guarantee if a mammal is killed that's lactating, the predators will definitely be consuming the milk as part of it. And there's actually been a species of feral cats observed on the Galapagos Island drinking the milk of seals. And why do they do that? Because they can get away with it. And that's why do we drink milk? Because we can raise animals, we can domesticate them, and we can get away with it. I'm not saying drink milk. If you don't want to drink it, don't drink it. But don't drink it because of stupid stuff you read on the internet.
Drink milk or another. Yeah, that is a silly argument. Is the lactose intolerance, is that a brought upon condition, or is that a genetic condition?
There's a small amount of people have it as genetic, but as humans, when we're babies, we can almost all of us happily consume breast milk, which contains lactose. When we're weaned, the enzyme that digests lactose, it actually declines. So over time, you actually can tolerate less and less lactose. But the key thing is Caucasians generally don't have much lower prevalence rates of lactose intolerance. Why is that? Because we've had dairy in our food supply for about 10,000 years. People from other ethnic backgrounds haven't had much exposure to it. So we've actually adapted to it naturally, which is why you see lower rates in Caucasians, higher rates in people from Asian background and African background. And that's just to do with human evolution. That's all.
What do you think about like these raw diets? Like I now have 3 male friends that are living entirely off of flesh, no milk, no vegetables, no fruits. And one of them only raw meat, like I just killed it, chopped it off, like not cooked. And I'm not like completely against trying that. And I saw a documentary of this guy, young dude, buys sheep, and like dry ages them in the garage, and family doesn't follow the diet. He goes out and whacks a chunk off, and he says like certain sinew and tendons are like sweet because his taste is so he can totally taste all of these separate components of the animal. So like he eats the tendons for dessert. And anyway, I'll let you.
Yeah.
That's
so you're talking about the carnivore diet here, aren't we?
I guess. I mean, I had a couple of guys have stayed at our house that like, where do you want to go for dinner? Anywhere that serves meat. And I realized talking to them, like one of them's only eaten flesh for years. That's it.
Yeah. So what I say about that is that there was a guy I saw in the media here in Australia a while back who followed just only ate potatoes for 1 year. And he was fine. He lived, he got all the nutrients he need with a little bit of supplementation. There was a university professor in nutrition that just did an all McDonald's diet as a way to show that even eating all junk food, if it's portion controlled, you can lose weight and your blood lipids improve and so on. Same thing with the carnivore diet. As a species, it's amazing how we can survive and thrive on a huge diversity of different types of foods. Now, I'm not saying that that's the best diet to follow, but we can survive on that if you want to do it. But we are a omnivore species. We have this whole microcosm in our gut called the gut microbiome, and the sorts of foods that they thrive upon are plant foods and fiber. So it's really the diversity of foods we can choose to eat that's probably for the best of our health. But where a carnivore diet gets a lot of interest is that if you make a big dietary change and just say you're eating loads of crap, and all of a sudden you just start eating just meat and, that's the most unprocessed food possible. Short-term people find they can do perfectly fine on it. They've got more energy levels, they lose weight. Joe Rogan did it for a month, got a huge amount of likes on his Instagram post where he lost all of this weight. But the thing is, he stopped it after a month because he just found it really hard to sustain. So the people you mentioned, if you can do a carnivore diet for months to years, good luck to you. For most people, I don't think you'd survive more than a couple of weeks because the novelty of just eating meat wears off pretty damn quick if you're saying no to all these other foods that you can't have in your diet.
So I've got another one here from our friend Jen. She says, is there a specific macronutrient ratio for everyone? Or is it in relationship to different goals such as weight loss or weight training?
Yeah.
Also, if one has a slow metabolism due to a suspected sluggish liver, can macro counting improve liver function, or otherwise what specific foods can increase or repair the liver? So those were kind of two questions.
Yeah.
Is there a specific macronutrient ratio for everyone? And then what foods can increase liver function or repair it?
Okay, so macro counting is popular at the moment. So this idea of eating in a particular ratio, but that's been around for some decades under different names.
What other names did people call that?
The zone diet. Have you ever heard of the zone diet?
Sure, I remember that.
Yeah,
90s.
So that's right. It was, old, that's an old trend. Now we have a different trend about eating macros. And the zone diet was you had to eat food in a particular macronutrient composition. I think it was 30% carbs, 40% protein, and 40% fat, but I could be wrong. That doesn't add up. I think it was 30, 30, 40. Anyway, the idea was you have to eat in this perfect ratio to optimize your metabolic enzymes, and that's the key to good health. And we're seeing a reinvention of that with these different type of macro diets. When I look at the research of different types of diets with different macronutrient compositions, it doesn't really make a big difference for people. But some people will do better on a lower carbohydrate diet than others. Some people will do better on a higher carbohydrate diet. We actually don't know how to predict that, but we do know that there is certainly individualization where some people seem to do better on a particular way. What that tells you is, though, it's individualized. So anybody says you have to eat at this particular macronutrient ratio is just selling you a one-size-fits-all approach. But if it works for you, then go for it. But there's no metabolic reason why we have to eat at a particular ratio of macronutrients. It can be very broad based upon our own individual preferences, and maybe even how our own metabolism deals with those particular foods. Some people actually may struggle with a high carbohydrate diet, so lower carb will work for them.
Where does this stuff come from? Did somebody just try it and it worked? So then they say this works, so let's codify it on a book. And There's not you guys are not at universities saying, and now I sound like I'm from Australia where we just say the university. You guys just say university, but you guys are not saying, okay, let's figure out the ratios and this is it. There's not science to that.
No, a lot of the time it's Amazon that drives it. The book sales, the book sales, the bestseller.
How about the?
And there's been a couple.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, I'm done with that. So it's really the book sales drive a popular one. A couple of ones. Have you ever heard of the Eat Right for Your Blood Type diet?
Oh yeah.
The idea, yeah. That was just a made up idea, but it was popular because of book sales, because it's very seductive based upon your blood type. I think it was. Again, I forget what they are because I really don't want to fill my brain too much with it. But if you're one blood type, you eat carnivore, more low carb, high meat. If you're another one, you eat a balanced diet. And if you're O, I think it's vegetarian. All it is just a prescriptive diet based upon your blood type. It has no science behind it. Chimpanzees have an ABO blood type and they eat all the same food. So it shows you how ridiculous it is. But it's popular because it came up with a solution for why you've gained weight, why your metabolism is sluggish. It's all because of your blood type. And it did well because it was a book on Amazon. It was a popular book rather than being just a bit of scientific research.
It's interesting. Humans think the herd mentality, if enough people are doing it, you just assume, well, all these people can't be wrong. Who am I to question the judgment of all of these people? Correct. And so you just go along with it.
So my favorite saying is that facts tell, but stories sell. And what's more powerful? Here's me talking about some nerdy research study or somebody's testimony of all the weight they've lost on a low carb diet, low fat diet, gluten-free diet, whatever. It's that personal story that sells really well, rather than the science.
You just brought up another question that I had in my head, but before I mention it, and I think that's a great point, I just wrote it down because I might use that as the title.
Feel free. I think I stole it from someone else a while ago, but obviously I don't have any copyright to it. All yours.
Yeah, so it's mine. I'm going to use it for the title of this podcast with you, so I don't feel bad. And then we'll underscore Tim stole it. the liver health. What is there? Some foods or dietary things to shore up liver function?
At best, there might be one or two herbals that have a little bit of research to, help improve your liver. But overall, just, diet and foods don't seem to make a big difference. Your liver does a pretty good job of removing toxins and things from your body. If you're drinking loads of alcohol, that's going to be toxic for your liver. So, cutting out drinking less alcohol will be of help. But there's nothing dietary, food related that I know has any impact upon your liver. Maybe some herbal supplements, perhaps. I think dandelion is one of them, a couple of others. So not so much, but I think
dandelion root, dandelion flower.
I think so. I've seen that mentioned, but this is getting into the world more of naturopathy and herbal, and I stick with more just the food side of nutrition. But the question probably was about hypothyroidism. They said liver. Probably what they're talking about is your thyroid gland and how that affects your metabolism.
Understood.
And hypothyroidism, and one of the most common conditions is called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, is very common, particularly in women. And that is certainly linked with weight gain if your metabolism drops. And there's a reason for that. It's because of your thyroid hormone levels.
You did a podcast about PCOS.
Yes.
And that kind of dovetails into this discussion, doesn't it?
It's sort of related. So PCOS is really a metabolic disease where insulin resistance is at the center of it. And that causes a whole lot of hormonal changes, which affects fertility. It affects androgen production, which is going to be testosterone, which in women is not such a good thing. Hence why you're getting facial hair. You see a lot of weight gain. You see more central adiposity. So PCOS is a hormonal disease, whereas hypothyroidism also is related, but not quite the same. But they're common problems, particularly seen in women.
And how does diet affect this?
Not a huge amount, surprisingly. So with PCOS, one of the best things is actually a small amount of weight loss. 5 to 10% loss of body weight will actually improve a lot of the symptoms of PCOS.
Interesting.
And for there, maybe a slightly lower carb, higher protein might be a bit better, but there's been a whole lot of varieties trialed and they all seem to work equally well. So again, whatever sort of dietary changes work for you is the best one to follow. rather than just being dogmatic. But weight loss per se is the key, not how you get there. With hypothyroidism, it's really about controlling, the weight gain. There's no miracle diet to treat or cure hypothyroidism. It's going to be taking medication that works the best for that.
My friend Jeff sent a link to an article, and the article is titled "Your Vegetables Want to Kill You." And I'm not gonna read the article, but he says, I've heard theories that vegetables and plants can emit a chemical toxin against predation, and that this chemical can be detrimental to humans. Any truth to any of it?
Well, I actually know that article. I'm pretty sure I know the article, but it's actually coming up with a different conclusion from memory. The idea is that, yes, plants are full of deadly chemicals. They're called, and I mentioned that before, it's natural pesticides that plants produce. The thing is, the dose of them is very low. And one of the interesting theories is why they may be good for us is actually create a small amount of stress in our body that our immune system and our body adapts to, and we get health benefits from it. So I think the article was talking about that, but actually was in favor of the health benefits of fruit, of vegetables.
No, I'm reading it. This article, this looks like it's written by, this looks like this gentleman that wrote this is citing a few sources, but what he is saying, and I'll send it to you offline.
Yeah, sure, please.
For you guys, this is was written by Keenan Erickson, Erikson. He wrote it in 2020. But what it looks like he's talking about is that we shouldn't be eating these things because the plants have evolved to stop creatures like us from munching on them, and we are forcing ourselves to eat poison. So you're saying, though, the studies have shown the opposite.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at decades of research into the merits of eating, mostly plant-based diet, it's all in favor of our health. So I'm aware of an article that reads very similar to that, but it's actually was arguing that these small amounts of natural chemicals are beneficial for us. Just like a small amount of sunlight is beneficial for us, too much increases the risk of skin cancer, but not getting any sun at all is harmful because of vitamin D production and so on. So you've got this sweet spot where a small amount of environmental stress is good for us. And the principle is called, hormesis, which applies to many different things. Small amounts bad, too much is bad. And there's a sweet spot in the middle. And for plant foods, even with these chemicals present, the overall benefit is to our health.
I dig it. How about this one? Our friend Lori says, new trend she's reading about, and Lori's a nurse. She says, I've read about something called leaky gut. There's foods that are bad for everyone, and they cause holes in the digestive tract, allowing toxins to leak out, giving people symptoms like inflammation, bloating, fatigue, headache, skin rashes. And there's doctors selling special blends of supplements that heal this if you follow their recommendations. What's going on with that?
So leaky gut is one of those. It's a popular diagnosis. It has no medical credence to it, but it is true that with certain disease states, our intestines increase permeability. So the idea of a leaky gut is quite seductive to say because you've got more holes in your gut, you let all these toxins through. But pretty much everything I've looked into this area, the change in permeability is a consequence of disease, not a cause of disease. So it sounds really great. Here's why you're sick and ill. It's because your gut is leaky. Take these supplements, eat these foods, and that will heal your gut and treat the disease. Where it's the disease in the first place, chronic inflammation and autoimmune conditions that cause some of the changes in permeability in the gut. They're not responsible for it.
But couldn't dietary problems, bad diet, have led to the inflammation?
Correct. Absolutely. Okay. There's a lot of dietary factors that are related to inflammation, but that itself doesn't cause, the leaky gut wasn't there to start with. It was because of these other factors, because the dietary advice for leaky gut is not, hey, have more McDonald's hamburgers and Coke. It's, clean your diet up, eat better, and take some of these supplements. And generally people feel better for it. But it's the same sort of advice you would give to somebody with IBS, PCOS, a whole range of other conditions. They all sort of fall under the same umbrella. So there is some truth to the idea of having a leaky gut. It's why I try and use the word intestinal permeability. That's what's used in the research. But it's more a consequence of disease not a cause of it. And typically the people pushing it as a diagnosis have supplements to sell you as well.
Makes sense. Is there a cleanse that will remove demons from your soul? Mr. Mike Shorten asked that one. You got any demon removal? I
don't know. Head south to a revivalist preacher, I reckon. Is that the answer? Demons be gone.
Yeah. My friend Dan, who's a pretty earth-friendly dude, he wrote, is it healthier to eat foods that are grown closer to where you live than it is to eat foods that are grown in other regions? And that's all he wrote. I don't know if he's talking about, excuse me, the freshness of the product coming to you, or if he meant more from like a global standpoint of transportation of food and fuel costs and global CO2 emissions and things like that, which I don't think is your area of study, but does fresh produce and things like that, is it better to eat stuff? I think I know he and I have talked about this. I'll add one thing to it. I remember in high school, I had to do something for health class. And so I wrote this piece on, excuse me, coffee down the wrong tube. I did this piece on, and there's no science behind it. It was a 17-year-old kid just musing, but I said, we should just eat the stuff that's around us when it's in season. Like Inuits eat freaking fish and almost no green things at all. And the people in tropical climates have access to all kinds of fresh fruits year round, which people in the North don't have, etc. So, maybe that's kind of what he's talking about. So then do we end up though, where we are starved for nutrients? Do we getting scurvy because there's no vitamin C?
Look, I like that essay that you wrote at school. That was perfect, because if you ate like that, you'd actually be pretty healthy. Because if you ate only what's produced locally, you're going to be eating a fairly healthy diet. So that's probably where that question is coming from. And the best way is locally is grow your own organic vegetable garden in your backyard, grow all your produce, and live off, go and live in a hippie commune, because that's not going to be what most of us are going to be doing. So realistically, we have to get food from afar. And the further it travels, there is your potential issue. We lose some nutrients with transport and storage. But if we're talking about fresh food, our biggest issue is that we don't eat enough of these foods to start with. But even the concept of food miles, and this is probably where it's getting, there's a food mile cost to getting your oranges growing, in the orchard in the neighboring county versus getting it from another country. Mm-hmm. It sounds like the local produce will be better for you, but if you look at economies of scale, like to ship large amounts of foods over large distances, it can actually work out as quite economically viable to do it that way. But you do lose some nutrients in the transport and storage, absolutely. But it's not as simple as you getting it from another country or the oil that's been burnt to get it there. The economies of scale actually reduce the cost quite a lot, compared to a little farmer having their little stall at the front of their farm and everybody travel to them to get the food. That's actually can be quite inefficient. So I guess I'm talking about more logistics and supply networks here, but it's not as clear cut as what it sounds. We like as humans to think we're supporting our local farmers and we're going to a local produce and we're doing good for the environment. But purely from a health, nutrition, and global perspective, it might be just okay getting the food that's produced in a different state or a different country at times. But you're not going to find a clear answer in the research that, one way is better than the other.
Makes sense. As you started to talk about that, I got to thinking about things like a canned tomato. Canned foods changed so much of the world because we could store things for the ability to remove the air from the jar and pressure pack change. And that's not that old of technology. What is it, 150 years old or something like that? Really, World War I is when the canned foods really came into existence. What nutrition wise, I know there's a degradation, but like if somebody fresh food is so expensive, I can go buy a big jar of tomatoes or can of tomatoes for $1 or $2 US. I don't know what it costs in Australia, but to buy how many fresh tomatoes to get in that can, it's oftentimes a ton more money. Just talk about that a little bit.
This is going to shock and surprise a lot of your listeners. If you compare the nutritional quality of frozen versus canned versus fresh produce. And the disclaimer is fresh produce is what you buy from the grocery store, not what you grow in your backyard.
Okay.
Nutritionally, there's very little difference. And the reason why is that what's frozen and what's canned is done so within 1 to 2 days after picking and processing. It happens at the farm, close to the farm site. Once you've done that process, the amount of nutrients lost after it is quite small. Whereas what we buy from the grocery store could have been sitting on the shelves for a couple of days after being in cold storage. It comes home, sits in our fridge or on the table for a couple more days. So you lose a lot of nutrients that way. So I always say that if you find that you eat healthier food by having frozen and canned on hand, fantastic. Your diet will be better for it. It doesn't always have to be fresh produce. And canned and frozen is just super convenient. And it's also, as you said, pretty cheap. So you're not doing any healthy harm.
It's not strange. There's no cost for refrigeration trucks and refrigeration trains. There's no cost for the grocery store to refrigerate it. All that cost is passed on to the end consumer, right?
That's right. And what you're buying is more mass produced, and the economies of doing it all in one go are quite surprising. And this adds to the earlier statement. We've got the most abundant, nutritious, healthy food supply and safest food supply in the history of mankind. And that's one of the reasons why. So it's always easy to be negative about food and processing and things, but there's actually a lot of benefits for us as a species.
I like it. I try to eat as much fresh, raw things as possible. I would prefer, if I'm eating, to have that over frozen or dried or canned, but I'm not against it. That as I'm listening to you, my father was and is a purveyor of all this type of information, and as are many people. And I could just hear him or other people, Dad, if you listen to this, say it to me later, but I can hear people going, this guy's a quack because there's this study or there's this doctor or, this person, and their book or their studies totally refute what this Aussie's saying. And who gives a shit anyway? Because that's an island of misfits that...
And he'll be dead right. Let's get back to the start. You could find a case for any particular food, nutrient, or theory that you want to push if you just selectively quote some research. I try and not do that. I just look at the broader, what does the bulk of research say? And that's the perspective I come from. But yeah, if you have a different viewpoint and you've got some research to support you, good luck to you. And if in the end, I don't give a shit. I find that you eat better for that your choice and your view, then that's all I care about. I'm not here to sell a dogmatic viewpoint. I'm not here to sell a vegetarian diet, an omnivore diet, a carnivore diet, a low carb diet. Do what works with you within this broad, bit of framework of things you might want to consider in the food choices you make, rather than being dogmatic and being another loud, noisy voice in the field of nutrition.
Is there anything that you are vehement about that you've had pushback on, maybe from other scientists, doctors? Is there you're talking about the carnivore diet. I don't know the author of that book personally, but I know people that do. If that guy's in the room with you, are you guys going to have a staring match? It turns into a fist fight. Is there anybody like that has ever reached out or just said, this Dr. Crowe's an idiot, he doesn't know what he's talking about?
Oh, of course, you put yourself out there in the world. As you know, Mickey, you have a social media profile and you do work in the media and you get people with different viewpoints. It's probably in the world of low carb. I've got a bit of it. In the early days, and this is probably more of my maturity as a scientist, I would just look at the evidence going, low carb is not a good diet. It has all these problems with it. And then you get pushed back for that. And then as time goes on and research changes, I know, if you can lose weight on low carb, that's good. Probably for someone with diabetes, a lower carbohydrate diet is probably better. And that's because the research has changed. And that's probably been one area where there's been pushback on viewpoints. So let's talk about a bit more inclusive.
So what I think I just heard you say is early on, less research, you stuck with what you knew and said, we need carbohydrates to live. Doing this might not be good. And then as more studies came about, so you're flexible. Like you said, you go to the studies and find where the bulk of the data is, and you go with that. I dig it.
What's the, I think it was one of our US presidents that said, as the facts change, so does my my views. And that's hard to do as humans. We actually don't like to change our views. We don't like to admit that maybe I was wrong. So it's nice to be at that stage in my career that I don't hold on to things as tightly. And you've probably heard it throughout this interview. Do what works for you. If you want to do this particular diet or you have this viewpoint, that's fine. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. I'm not here to sell you a book. I don't have an online program. I don't have any subscription to anything I do. This is just my information I put out there for people to take on board and do with what they want, rather than being another dogmatic view in the world of nutrition.
That's a good way to be. Talk about the low carb for a bit. Like, it's become another one of those things, like bread is the devil and pasta's the devil and pizza's the devil. And I'm not a huge pasta or bread eater, just because I'd rather have a piece of meat and like a hunk of broccoli or something like that.
Yeah.
That's what satiates me. I mean, I like a nice pizza or sandwich, but just comment on that a little bit.
So this probably came from dietary guidelines some years ago that did have a bigger focus on carbohydrates. And then in the 1970s, low carb was fairly big. Otherwise, you had a diet called Protein Power. And that came into out of fashion. And in the late 90s, there was the big one. That was the Atkins diet. You all would have heard about that. It was huge Dr. in America.
Atkins, yeah.
Dr. Atkins, which spent a whole range of wonderful food products, such as low carb vodka, low carb coffee. You eat much healthier because of these sorts of foods. And then that went quiet for a while. And now low carb is rebranded. And what's it rebranded under? Keto. So it's all just the same name for a similar way of eating. What a low carb diet does, though, is it just means that overall you're likely to eat less food. Because if for the average Australian/American, about 45 to 50% of the calories they consume each day comes from carbohydrates. Now, but half of those is actually sugar. Most of it's been added to food, and a lot of it is actually highly processed grains. We actually don't eat a lot of, what I call really, really good quality starchy carbohydrates. Guess what happens when you cut out?
What's a good carbohydrate?
Carbohydrates that haven't undergone a lot of processing. So this would be whole grain foods. This would be, potatoes, sweet potatoes, foods that are still in their natural state. Most of the carbohydrates we eat is added sugar, and it's things like white bread, white flour, white pasta, and so on.
So me eating a baked potato with a nice pat of some Irish butter on it and some sea salt, that's not bad for me.
Sounds delicious. Absolutely.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I eat the skin in all of those bad boys.
Excellent. So I told you that guy in Australia that followed an all potato diet for a year. He lived, he lost weight and felt better.
I must have not heard you. I thought you said he lived on nothing but potatoes.
Nothing but potatoes.
Not sweet potatoes, white flesh potatoes.
Maybe it was a variety of them, but I think it was just one particular type. Now, when I first heard this, I thought, this is crazy. He's going to get all these nutritional deficiencies. But when I actually looked at it as a nutritionist, the nutritional profile of potatoes, even the protein content, if he had enough of it, was probably enough to live on and sustain himself. So he did pretty well.
What's this cat's name? I need to look this guy
you'd have
up.
to just Google potato diet guy. I think he's got a website. So I'm not saying you just go on an all potato diet, but hey, it works.
No, it's just interesting. I just want to see
it's a fascinating human experiment, just like Morgan Spurlock in Super Size Me. Now, the interesting thing was it wasn't the McDonald's food that did that to him. It was actually, he was eating double the calories he needed each day from McDonald's. And guess what happened? You gained
get fat.
10 to 20 pounds in a month, and all these enzymes liver enzymes thrown out of whack. The university nutrition professor in America that had an all McDonald's diet lost weight and got healthier for it for that particular time because he just kept it portion control. So it's not saying McDonald's is the healthiest food that you can eat, but it was the overconsumption of the food that was his biggest issue, not so much the particular foods that he chose to eat. So this is about 5,000 calories a day.
That's how many calories?
5,000 calories a day Morgan Spurlock was eating. And he gained 20 pounds. Who would have thought?
Yeah, that seems like it's such a simple calculation that so many people overlook. I can't lose weight. I can't lose weight. I can't lose weight. But you're consuming 2 or 3 times the caloric requirements on a daily basis. Like now, intermittent fasting is a thing, which I always joke with people like, oh, you intermittent fast? Like, no, I'm just not eating because I don't need it because I'm sitting on my ass all day, in this chair. I was a carpenter for most of my life, and I would wake up with a ravenous appetite because I was up and down ladders and humping lumber on my shoulder all day. And now I'm sitting in trucks and doing this.
Yeah.
And so I don't have the same hunger, but that's, how about that? Is that a thing? Intermittent fasting like that
It
we
is.
should be doing?
It's actually a growing trend. And I'm a tacit supporter of it in the sense that it's not a miracle hack that everybody should do. But there's no reason why we have to eat breakfast at a particular time. And for some people, if you're not doing a lot of activity and you don't feel you need to eat, then actually you don't need to eat. We don't die of starvation and malnutrition because we missed a breakfast or had a smaller dinner or lunch. We can actually do quite well on it. So while intermittent fasting can work quite well is that you have longer periods where you're not eating. Now, if it's about weight loss, if you compare intermittent fasting versus just a traditional calorie diet, on average, people just do the same on each of them. It's not some superior weight loss hack. Some people do well, some people do not so well. But where there might be some additional benefit is some metabolic effects the fasting periods have to do with your insulin levels and other hormones. And that's where the interesting bit is. But I say to people, and I've been doing this for years, I don't eat breakfast, not because I want to or don't want to, I'm not hungry. But
so you don't force yourself to sit down and have flapjacks and an omelet. I
just don't feel like eating in the morning. I'll eat about 11, 12 o'clock. Now, from the breakfast cereal manufacturers, they go, oh, no, your breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Have this breakfast cereal. If you're a child and you're sent to school without breakfast, you do worse. And this is where the school breakfast programs work quite well. But as an adult, where you have a choice, if you're not hungry, then you really don't need to wait till you feel hungry. And I say that in a Western environment where we've got so much food available to us, it's actually not that harmful to miss food every now and then. So I'm not saying that everyone has to do it, but don't feel compelled to eat by the clock if your body says I'm not hungry and I'm doing well otherwise. And what I find is that I'm more mentally sharp with a mild amount of fasting that I'm doing. I actually quite enjoy it. And a lot of people report that as well. They actually feel more energetic. Whereas if I eat a big breakfast or a big lunch, I'll feel sluggish and slow from it. So
I agree.
But hey, I've lived. I'm not wasting away to nothing. My weight doesn't change. So it works for me.
How old are you, Doc?
So I'm 52.
52. And I've never met you in person, but you look like you're pretty slim and trim in the videos that I've seen. So you're not... in my world, I say you can still see what you need to when you're taking a leak.
I like that one. That's me, but I've got no special diet. One of the biggest compliments I got about my podcast was somebody saying that I actually have no idea what I eat. Now, I say that because I don't put any of my own particular views about whether it should be vegan or carnivore or low carb or whatever. It's quite open. But there's no superfoods in this house. I eat meat. I have dairy products. I eat grains, I eat junk food, I eat a whole variety of foods. But the key is I don't eat a lot of it and I eat what I like according to taste. But with it, overall principles of always trying to eat healthier. But just because I've got all the information doesn't mean you've got a perfect diet.
Do you drink fountain drinks, soda pop? I don't know what you guys call it down there.
No, I don't. That's one thing I just don't like the taste of. It's just too much sugar. I drink the diet versions, Coke, no sugar, but not the full sugar ones.
Do you drink them on the regular or just on occasion?
Just occasion.
Okay. Like I know people that drink 6 or 8 Diet Cokes every single day or more.
That's interesting about the diet drinks. They come up as being quite, a lot of health issues with them. But what I say to people is that if you're drinking those rather than the full sugar ones, you're better off for it. But I treat them as more of a gateway to maybe having less of the diet drinks and having milk or water or juice instead. But they're a nice intermediary because the evidence is pretty clear. If you drink loads and loads of soda pop, soft drink, whatever you want to call it, it's linked with higher weights, higher risk of diabetes and so on.
You're way nicer than me. I'd say just stop drinking all of it because it's garbage.
Probably.
But I'm not a scientist.
And here's me still drinking the odd diet drink. But yeah, it's up to you. And there are better drinks. I drink alcohol. That's a class 1 carcinogen. So it's all about perspective in life. We get too carried away with foods and toxins and pesticides, but there's other things we happily and willingly do that we put into our bodies.
Yeah.
I like a beer, I like spirits, but yeah, there's nothing that really healthy about them. So there's other things
bullshit.
To help.
That is bullshit.
I'm going, you're going to edit this bit out. No way. You're not getting that message out there.
I don't know if I'm a picture of health. I have a few nice beers every night after training. I train at the gym. I will be there in an hour at the jiu-jitsu gym. And I'll have 2-3 beers afterwards and I feel great. My blood markers are all good. So I'm gonna keep doing that.
It's the dreaded M word, moderation, which is a boring word to use, but that's works for you as you're not going overboard, not going crazy. And what
I call it an off switch. You have to have an off switch.
And here's the thing: nutrition is not just about health. Nutrition and food is about enjoyment, and it's about other things we do in our life, and also just what things we choose is important to us. You mentioned you go to the gym, you go to jiu-jitsu. I mean, the benefits of physical activity are one of the greatest things you can ever do for your health. So that offsets any other things you want to be doing. So I try and put it in perspective about a whole lifestyle, because other people have more things to do in their time than read randomized controlled trials about different types of diets and health. It's important. You can take note of it, but it's one decision we make throughout the day amongst a whole lot of other things we do based upon our health and our simple enjoyment of life.
So it seems like maybe we put blame on certain foods and dietary habits that maybe shouldn't be there. And then sometimes we're overlooking things that we're consuming or quantities, and we're like people eating 5,000 calories, not exercising, and they're not losing weight. And that's pretty blatant. Well, it's just, we like to eat these things.
Yeah, we do. And we like to try and blame something else for whatever situation we've got in. Hence, blaming the macronutrients you're consuming, or blaming gluten, or blaming something else, when overall it's just going to be a whole bunch of dietary choices and lifestyle choices that you've made. And it comes down to what's important to you in changing and what reasons you want to do it. So you mentioned earlier on about having goals, about what you want to get out of it. Do you want to be in as best health as possible, to live a long, healthy, and fairly disease-free life? And if that's your goal, there's changes you need to do now that are a lifelong commitment, but it shouldn't be something that feels like it's a chore and you're not enjoying. Because if it does feel like that, you'll be like any other diet that's come along and gone, that you won't be doing it within 3 or 6 months. You need that ongoing validation and feedback. And one thing that happens when people start eating healthier, and typically they will do that with any diet fad that comes along, is they feel better, they've got more energy, and that promotes positive dietary changes. And it also affects their mental health as well. So there's a lot of interest now in diet and mental health. The summary is it all comes back to eating more of a dietary pattern or a dietary theme that is not too different to what you would recommend in broad dietary guidelines, or a Mediterranean style diet, or a diet that's basically just mostly minimally processed foods. It's mostly plants, but it can include meat, chicken, fish, and dairy foods if you want to eat. Nothing controversial, nothing sexy about it. But getting back to those basic nutrition messages is the key to good health and longevity. And that's what people in the blue zones have been doing for thousands of years.
I like it. I've got another question real quick, and then I'm going to wrap up and ask you to tell people how to find you and all that. Packaged electrolytes. There's a lot of brands on the market now. Like there used to just be Gatorade and things like that were sports drinks. I actually heard you talk about sports drinks. A friend of mine who is no longer with us, his name's Joel. Joel was a Green Beret medic. Joel turned me onto a company called Drip Drop. And this isn't a sales pitch for Drip Drop, but it's the doctor that designed those was overseas working with children, and he did not have enough IVs for these kids that were dying of dehydration from dysentery. So he created this Drip Drop product that they could help these kids uptake some fluids. Anyway, I buy that in bulk. I use it at our training programs. It's got a little bit of sugar. There's another product, friend of our group, a guy named Rob, created that is got no sugar. He also has a similar background as a scientist to you. I think that product is called, what the heck's the name of it? It's called, it'll pop in my head. Anyway, here's the argument. Do you need the sugar to uptake the electrolytes in your small intestine? Or, because that's what some people say, you have to have some sugar with these electrolytes or they just flush right through. And that's the argument, like sugar, no sugar with the electrolytes. Have you heard this discussion?
It's not been a common one I've heard put in for or against them. But when glucose, and mostly it's going to be a form of glucose, when that's transported across your gut, sodium is part of that transport, and sodium is the key electrolyte in your extracellular fluid. So it's probably related to that.
That's exactly it.
So that's where it's coming from. But I would say, unless you're in a third world country with diphtheria or cholera, getting your hydration in a bit quicker is not that big a deal. Our body can do pretty well on just plain water. So these sports drinks may help and speed it up a little bit.
And we're talking about people that are like high performance athletes that are sweating for long lengths of time, elite soldiers, things of that nature.
So for those guys, the electrolytes in these drinks, are not a huge amount. And most of the electrolytes they'll replenish will they'll actually get from food, eating normally, not at that particular time. So I haven't seen anything to say that you absorb less of the electrolytes when you've got a sugar-free version versus a glucose one, but I actually don't know fully the answer. But it's not an area that I've seen rapid debate in the sports nutrition world about. I would say that overall the glucose is there to help replenish glycogen stores, which if you're a high-performance athlete, that should be important to you. If you're just a weekend sports person and you want to lose a bit of weight, well, the no sugar ones would be better for you. High performance, I would want the glucose in there.
And that glycogen stores is one, I think that guys are working out, then they think sugar's bad, but they forget that they need this glycogen that they just burned up.
Yeah, that's right. So you actually want to replace that during a sports event. We'll call it a marathon or a triathlon or something that's going for 2 or 3 hours. That extra glucose is important, and it's a great way to take it on. Post-exercise, though, to replenish your glycogen stores, sure, you could use a sports drink, but also you could do something called food, and you just eat, and that will do just as good a job over 24 hours.
That's funny. That's funny. All right. You have any articles, books that you've written that you think are a good intro for people to dig into your work, and then we'll tell them how to find your podcast?
So I would say my podcast and my website contains pretty much all of the nutrition information that I get asked about a lot and that I communicate on a lot. So some of the themes about today are in podcasts, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. So Thinking Nutrition is my podcast. My website is thinkingnutrition.com.au, and there's about 150 articles on there, all free to use on your own websites if you want. I do have one book, but it's a university textbook. So I'm not here flogging a bestseller on Amazon. But if you really want to deep dive into some of the nutrition science in the world, I have a textbook called Understanding Nutrition. So that's really catering for a market that really wants to delve into it. But it's at a level that probably a general reader could get quite a bit out of it. But it's a different sort of book compared to, blast your fat in 12 weeks and be the best person you can be, that you would find as a bestseller on Amazon. I
like it. The website, I really like. You can just instantly scroll through all those podcasts, click right on them, which I've been pouring through them. Again, that web address to the homepage. So thinkingnutrition.com.au. You'll get all my content there. You can connect with me on social media. But yeah, probably much the podcast is the way to go. So it's great chatting with a fellow podcaster today about podcasting. I appreciate it. Final thoughts. If people here that have listened, if they don't cross your path again, if they never meet you in person, if you could take the totality of your life, maybe not even your work, maybe something philosophical or something not even to do with diet concerns. If you would leave them with something, what would it be? You're a human being. We don't get it right all the time. Focus on getting things 80% right, be it your commitment to eating healthier, your commitment to exercise, your commitment to being a better person. And if you get to 80%, you're doing pretty damn well compared to most other people. So what you're saying is just strive to be in 80%. Strive to be good. Don't strive to be perfect in every sense. You can get to 100, that's great. But particularly with food and nutrition, the idea that you have to eat a particular way is just not realistic. At times, some junk food is good to eat. I eat it and enjoy it when you do. But 80% of the time, if you can be eating pretty healthy, then that's the biggest part of the battle. If you want to go for that extra 20%, good luck to you. But the biggest gains come from the first 80%, not the last 20% when it comes to your health. I like that. If there was one thing people could cut out of their diet, that's part of the staples in our industrialized nation, what would it be? So if you're looking at foods and ingredients, it would be the added sugar. Added sugar. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Generally, added sugar will be a marker that this food is not healthy for you. By added sugar, we're saying a peach has natural sugar in it. We're saying not the jar of peaches that has corn syrup mixed into it, and it's a slurry of sugar.
That is it. So I think there's a push in from the US FDA about changing labeling in America so that sugar has to be split up between added sugar and natural sugar. And so I'm talking about the added sugar. So if you want to drink milk that contains lactose, that is natural sugar. You eat fruit, that's natural sugar, but anything added by the food manufacturer is going to be added sugar. And you'll see it on the ingredient list typically. But just looking at the sugar line item on the nutritional information panel doesn't always tell you if it's natural or added. But you've got it. We've all got brains. Just think about it. You know, is this a piece of fruit or is it a highly processed food? If it's a highly processed food, it's going to be added sugar.
I dig it. You guys that have watched, I hope that you got something out of it. It's a great pleasure that we've got to spend the time with Dr. Crowe. I hope that you do go visit their website and pour through some of those podcasts. You've got all this access to amazing information. Just 10, 20 years ago, you would have had to pay to go to school or go sit in his office to ask these questions. And now the body of all this information is available for you. Use it, because as he just said, the goal is to live. And that's kind of what we say every day, a long, full life. And food is such a huge part of it. So I appreciate you very much. If you dug the podcast, share it. Leave a comment, depending on which platform you're watching or listening on. Leave a comment with a question, and maybe we'll get him on again in the future and scrape those comments together into another group of questions. Thank you, Doc.
Been wonderful chatting with you today, Mickey.
I appreciate it.
Visit our website, carrytrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., Carry Trainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@carrytrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@carrytrainer.com or carrytrainer.com. What are you doing in the podcast room, Steve?
I'm writing a national anthem. It's going to be at folk festivals for gunfighter gun oil.
Oh.
Let me tell you about gunfighter gun hire. Made in the USA. Gunfighter gun oil. It's gonna last you, baby, yeah. Gunfighter gun oil is the best I've ever seen. It's gonna make you get everything that you've ever seen. Oh, baby, I love me some gunfighter gun oil. Yeah. Oh, gunfighter gun oil, gunfighter.
Get my lighter out. I don't have it.
It wasn't even Bob Dylan. It was like a love story.